So welcome to this webinar called What Happens When You Can't Afford to Die. I'm Lindsay Mace and I manage Down to Earth, which is the only UK-wide funeral cost helpline run by independent charity Quaker Social Action. And you can see that we have all of our brilliant development workers here today, the whole team. So you will get to meet and hear from all of us today. As you can see, we are a small team, but I feel confident saying that we have a big impact. So as I said, there will be a Q&A at the end, so please do submit any questions as we go along, and we'll answer as many as we can when we get there. So I'd just like to start with a clip of one of our clients, because after all, they are why we do what we do. So I'm just going to share my screen. Amanda's son died unexpectedly, 21, and Amanda's struggle to bury him was captured by a Guardian video in 2019.
I feel in the pain right now. I want my son. I can't get him back. He's dead. And I'm sitting here. I'm worrying about finding the money. I'm worrying about charity giving us the money. I'm worrying about, I have to bury my son. I'm worried about my kids. I still can't even grieve the way I want to grieve.
So just in that short clip there, I think you can sort of really get the power of the piece, but if you haven't seen the video, I would really recommend watching it. It is a tough watch, but it's only 20 minutes, and we'll put the link in the chat at the end. So now I'm just going to share a few slides to tell you a bit about who we are. Before I go on and introduce the first team member. So, as I said, we're a project of Quaker Social Action, and we offer practical support to people struggling with funeral costs, where the funeral hasn't yet taken place. We also, as well as that one-to-one support, we offer or we provide significant online resources to help people help themselves through sort of ways of reducing funeral costs and also raising money towards funeral costs. But we also carry out strategic work to try and make change within the funeral industry, central government and local governments, so that we can effectively try and help far more people in a permanent way. And one of the things that we sort of do within that is that we run and administer something called the Fair Funerals Pledge, which is a pledge that funeral directors can sign up to show that they are committed to price transparency, because that's a significant problem in the industry and has been for a long time. So that's who we are. Why does our service exist? So just a quick map there, that probably the contents of which probably won't come as a sort of particular surprise to many people, I imagine, but just showing these average costs of a simple funeral across the UK. And that gives you an idea of why our service is needed, because several £1,000s is a lot of money to most people. And indeed, 9% of people, which is nearly 1 in 10, who are faced with paying for a funeral, struggle with the costs. That was found by Royal London in their report last year. And the average debt that is taken on is over £1,700. So again, an idea of why we're here. So what kind of impact do we have? How do we help people? So to give you a sense of our impact in numbers, last year, 2020 to 21, we gave support to 643 clients. And you can see there the kind of the speed of our response in terms of how quickly we're able to get back to people who contact us. Then sort of costings there in terms of the amount of money that we help people to save. on average on their funeral costs from the people who have provided us with that information, and also the amount of money that we help people to raise towards their funeral bills. Just to say that we're not a grant giving charity, but there are lots of other charities and other sources of funds out there that we are able to help people to access to help them with their funeral bills. And the last one there, about our online resources, but specifically about a new guide that we created last year in response to the coronavirus pandemic, that is specifically around arranging a funeral during the pandemic, and has been accessed by a really sort of quite a surprising number of people, over 14,000 people, which is incredible reach. So it was really great to see that. So I also just wanted to share some comments from some of our clients, because while numbers can be helpful and can tell us a lot, they can sometimes stop us seeing the people behind them. So I just wanted to leave you before I hand over to Sophie with some of our impacting client words. You have no idea the pressure this has taken off of us. We couldn't have done it without you. I felt completely alone until I spoke to you. You have been a great support and you have made me stronger. Speaking to you has helped me know what to do. I was so worried I ended up in A&E, but now I have an idea of what I need to ask and do next. Always feel a bit choked actually when I read sort of comments that clients have said to us, because I think it really shows the sort of what a vulnerable position people are in, and the impacts that we managed to have, and it's a real privilege to be in that position supporting people. So unsurprisingly, this last year has seen even more of a call on our service than usual. We were exceptionally busy during the two COVID-19 peaks, taking on more than double the number of clients between December and March, just gone, than the previous year. And so at this point, I should say that there are some people who aren't here today, and those are the wonderful volunteers that helped us during those two peaks by triaging calls to help us prioritise calls appropriately and enable us to keep responding to people as quickly as possible. Now, on that note, that's enough from me. I'm going to hand over to Sophie, who is going to tell you a bit about what it's been like for her supporting people during the pandemic specifically. So thank you, Sophie.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. Hi everyone, I'm Sophie. I'm one of the development workers here at Down to Earth. I actually joined the team just back in October, so right in the middle of the pandemic. And my previous experience was actually in the funeral profession. So I've kind of seen the pandemic from both sides. Now, funeral directors, as a rule, their general answer, if you want anything for a funeral, is yes, as long as it's legal-ish and physically possible. But with the beginning of the pandemic and that sudden drop of restrictions coming down on us, funeral directors had to start doing something that they were really not used to doing, and saying no to people. No, you can't have limousines at the moment because of social distancing. No, you can't see your son in the chapel of rest at the moment because of the pandemic. We don't know what the risk is. I'm sorry, you can't touch the coffin at the end of the ceremony. You can't go and say that last farewell because of the pandemic. And you can't sit next to your newly widowed mum in the crematorium because you don't live together and you're not in the same social bubble. Now, naturally, some of these restrictions meant that funeral bills overall came down. Many extra services weren't possible, and things like orders of service weren't quite as necessary. The company I worked for saw a significant rise in people requesting direct cremations and looking at arranging a larger celebration of life at a later date once the restrictions had eased. I don't think anyone saw this lasting quite as long as it has. We did see some more creativity around funeral arrangements though, and a gorgeous friend of mine actually had her funeral in the street outside her house, in the beautiful blazing sunshine, and it was just a beautiful day for her. So when I joined Down to Earth in October, right in the middle of the pandemic, the restriction changes had somewhat stabilised. So practically speaking, it was easier to let clients know what those restrictions were, what they can and can't be having. But it was really apparent that the pandemic was leaving people under a great deal of financial pressure and a great deal of financial strain. And we were seeing approximately 30 calls a week during the peaks of the pandemic. As a team, we've supported clients with repatriations. As we know, travel at the moment is minimal, so reduced flights have impacted in higher costs and unpredictability in the arrangements. And some clients we found want to delay funeral arrangements to when more people can attend. We're probably seeing that a little bit more now with the restrictions kind of easing. And unfortunately, that does quite often lead to additional costs from funeral directors for storage fees and care of the deceased. Now, in my time working in the funeral service, one of our celebrants, who I knew quite well, said something that's kind of stuck with me, which is, it's like another layer of grief has been added for the bereaved, as they can't actually offer that physical comfort to each other and just be with each other. And I've noticed that a lot of clients do confide in us, not just about their financial worries, but about how they're feeling, their isolation and loneliness. And distance seems larger. You know, you can't just pop round to your neighbours for a cup of tea and a chin wag just to see how you're doing or to pop a meal round. You can't be close as you could before. And some clients have said that they find themselves talking a lot to their pets. I'm sure we've all encountered that, anyone with an animal. I'm very guilty of this, and pets actually I found make a great icebreaker for talking. And I'm sure I'm not the only one who takes advantage of petting the cat to make herself feel a bit better. So we've seen firsthand how the pandemic has affected people's finances, but also how charities, charitable organisations have adapted to the new types of hardship that are incoming and the new amount of people who are requesting their help. And one that comes to mind is the Care Workers charity. Some of you may have heard of them. They've set up their own COVID-19 emergency fund for people who are having to isolate, who've been in the care industry, who are struggling either due to their own illness or having to self-isolate due to the pandemic. An example of this, of how helpful this particular fund has been, is one of my clients. Now, I've changed his name for anonymity. So I've called him David, and his wife died sadly during the pandemic. Now, although he was actually over retirement age, David was still employed with the NHS, but he had been shielding at home due to his wife's illnesses. So his wages had reduced, he had no opportunities for overtime, and they'd completely depleted their savings. So when his wife died, David wasn't able to afford a funeral. His application to the Care Workers charity, based on his wife's work history, was successful. And he actually received £1,500 from the charity towards his wife's funeral costs. And we were also able to carry out a benefits calculation and arrange for David to put in a claim for pension credit to top up his state pension, which meant that in turn he could claim the funeral expenses payment. Now, David said to me he was so relieved he could give his wife a proper funeral rather than be forced down the route of a direct cremation, which was all he could afford. Now, I've got to say, I'm always really, really chuffed when grants come through to my clients. And I will admit to little happy dances when they come through. Now, I'm aware that the pandemic as a subject is really gloomy. So I wanted to leave you with a little bit of positivity from one of my clients. Again, his name's been changed for anonymity, so I've called him John. He was a full-time student, and as we know, students normally go for jobs such as bar work, supermarket work that can fit around their studies. But these jobs were very restricted due to retail closure and hospitality closures. And John had to shield due to his mum's poor health, and he was his mum's carer. Now, somehow John contracted COVID-19, which he then unfortunately passed to his mother, which ultimately was listed on her death certificate. So now, on top of his studies, John had a funeral to arrange, a funeral bill to cover, and was also taking over the responsibility for the flat they lived in. On top of that, he felt dreadfully guilty for bringing COVID into the household, which ultimately, as he saw it, killed his mum. Now, to cover the £6,200 bill for his mother's funeral, we made a combination of charity applications and some crowdfunding, which raised the required amount for the funeral costs. And John has since actually been in touch with me to say that he was absolutely appalled at the amount of support, or the lack of support rather, that was available for students suffering a bereavement. And so he's looking into arrangements to set up something to support students who find themselves in a similar situation. And so I hope that leaves you with a little bit of positivity after quite a gloomy subject. I'll hand you back over to Lindsay now. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks very much, Sophie. And it's really great to have some insider insights from the funeral industry too. Now, as our impact numbers showed, one of the things that we help people to do is to reduce funeral costs, so to reduce their bill. So I'm going to hand over to Gloria, who has just magically appeared in this wonderful virtual world that we're in, to talk about her experience of supporting people with this issue. Thank you, Gloria.
Okay. Good afternoon. I'm Gloria. I'm one of the development workers in the Down to Earth team. I want to share a few examples from my recent work where I've been able to assist my clients to reduce the cost of the funeral that they've been arranging. Several of the referrals that come into us at Down to Earth are from people who've already obtained a quote, which they know they can't afford. And in their discussion with the funeral director, it's likely that the funeral director has offered the suggestion of, well, if you don't have a burial and you have a cremation, you'll get a cheaper cost. And so many people will have changed to that cremation to reduce their costs. But if you're on a low income, if you're on benefits, even the cost of the cremation is something that's hard for you to cover the cost of. It's hard to find the money. So Down to Earth, one of the things that we would like to suggest to people when they first arrive with us and ask about how they're going to sort out the circumstances is that we suggest that it's good to get some other quotes. It's good to shop around. I know that if I was going to buy a car or going to buy an outfit, I wouldn't find it weird to go and look at several different prices so I could get the best one for what I could afford. And it's a similar thing we're suggesting that people do here. I've got 3 examples from some recent cases that I've worked with where the families have been supported to do just that. The first one was a lady who had never arranged a funeral before. And when she set about doing this, she'd accepted the first quote from the only funeral director she'd spoken to. And so when she came to me, knowing that she couldn't cover the cost, she was convinced that in fact that would be the only price she would get. She thought all funeral directors charged the same amounts, so she didn't need to look elsewhere. And she was also convinced that she couldn't even change funeral director. She'd already agreed to the quote. I was able to explain to her how funeral costs are actually worked out, so there can be variety. And I was also able to explain to her, you can change funeral director. You don't have to stay with the first one if it's not the best price for you. We were able to look at some of the funeral directors, other funeral directors in her area, and with the additional quotes that she was able to get, she found a cost that was going to be £1,000 less than she was currently expected to pay. And what was really positive for her is that that £1,000 was even after she paid £200 to the original funeral director who had asked for a payment for their minimal involvement. They had collected the body originally. They felt that they'd been supportive to us, so they needed to have something basically for what they'd already done. But even with that, she still saved over £1,000. That's one example. A second one, which was quite distressing actually from the outset, was a young man. He was in his 20s, lived with his uncle, and his uncle had died. He was now alone with no family support. All the family were overseas. He was distressed because of his uncle's death. He was in a great deal of grief. And he felt that he was under a lot of pressure from his family because he now had to get all the arrangements made for this uncle to get back home for a ceremony for their funeral. And the funeral director had told him the repatriation was going to cost over £10,000. He was in such a state that the stress had caused him to have a really bad panic attack, and he'd actually ended up in hospital thinking he was having a heart attack. Thankfully, it was a panic attack. It was something they were able to support him with. But even after he recovered, the funeral bill didn't change. There was no sympathy with what he was going through emotionally. And so what we did, again, started with is let's look at the prices of other funeral directors. Let's see if there is an alternative before you get into the depths of this. And we contacted a number of funeral directors that Down to Earth had contact numbers for and are aware of because they do repatriations. And he was able to get a quote for under £4,000. He was saving almost £7,000 at the end in terms of what the first bill was and what we then found the best costs available, with no change in what that repatriation was going to involve. And he was delighted. I mean, the stress relief in this young man was immense. And he felt now that he was no longer under the pressure that his family were previously putting on him. And he actually felt that he was going to do something that he could be quite proud of in making all the arrangements for the family. A third example where we've done some shopping around, we've got extra quotes and been able to reduce the cost, didn't involve the family actually moving to a new funeral director. The family I was working with had been quoted £7,000 for the burial of a relative. And again, we felt, when they first spoke to me, I felt it would be good still to know that this was the best price we could get for what they were asking to have happen. And we spoke to some local funeral directors in their district, and they came away at the end with a cost that was going to be £400 less. Doesn't sound like a lot, but everything does count when you're trying to find the money for these funerals. When they went back to the first funeral director they'd spoken to, that funeral director was actually prepared to match the lower cost. And that's what they did. They matched the lower cost. They didn't change any of the arrangements that they'd already discussed. So this family, having got information, having prepared themselves for what really was out there, was able to negotiate a fee that was going to be far more, not more affordable, but brought it down. It made it a little bit more, less money to find, in fact. But that's not the only way. Shopping around is just one thing. That's a good starting place. But there are other things you can do. Just two more examples that I'd like to share with you. One concerns a family I worked with who wanted to have a really personal touch included in the funeral that they were planning. And they wanted to have the coffin purple because it was the favourite colour of the person that had died. And it was a colour that her young children wanted to see being used in the funeral. It was going to be important to them. And the funeral director had no problem about this. Just as Sophie said earlier, they will say yes to almost everything if it's achievable. And they'd said yes, they'd paint the coffin, but they were going to charge £345 to do that. And so that £345 was added onto the bill. I spoke to the family about what was important to them, about the colour, why it was important. And I suggested an alternative. They already had flowers on their costs. And I said, why don't we have all the flowers in purple? That would achieve the colour requirements, but it wouldn't be adding anything extra to the bill. And that's exactly what they did. All the flowers were then in purple. It didn't add any more money in terms of the flower cost, but it took away the £345, which brought the bill down a little bit. One of my colleagues had also suggested that we could have talked about having some fabric in purple that could have been bought and draped over the coffin, and 2.5 meters of satin would be nothing in price compared to the £345 they were otherwise being asked to pay. So that's just another example of what could have been done. Still thinking about flowers, it's not unusual for families to reduce the cost of their funeral bill by either asking for a florist to arrange the flowers or to do the arrangement themselves. They can get the flowers from a supermarket, and that therefore takes away the cost that the funeral director would otherwise be adding on. And one of my families weren't in the position to even afford that as an alternative. They really felt they could not afford that. They had lots of things they needed to look at in reducing what was a very hefty bill. But not having flowers, they were concerned not having the flowers would stand out. And they were also concerned that if it stood out that much, that people would think they were cutting corners. And they felt quite embarrassed by that. They didn't want that to be something that was noticeable, something that people would talk about afterwards. And so we talked about that concern, and we talked about, well, what could we do to make no flowers be a deliberate feature? And so the suggestion I made is, well, have no flowers at all. Ask everybody that's coming, please, no flowers. And instead, just write something on a card, a tribute, a goodbye. And at the time of the service, at the time of the actual burial, those cards would be thrown into the coffin where the burial is going to take place. And that's exactly what they've done. And so again, they were able to remove that cost that they couldn't afford, but not have it so noticeable that they felt that they'd done something bad, they'd done something negative that people would be pointing the finger at. As I said, there's several ways to reduce costs. And what I've just told you are just a few. Some are more imaginative than others, but these are just a few examples of what we do at Down to Earth in helping people to bring down that initial cost that the funeral director has shared with them.
Thank you so much, Gloria. There's some really brilliant examples in there, and yeah, some real creativity, as you said. So thank you for that. It really does show what a difference it can make if people shop around as well. So joining me next is Claire to give you a behind-the-scenes look at helping people raise money for funeral costs. So we're going to have a little chat here, Claire, aren't we? Yeah. So you wanted to sort of tell us about a particular client today who we're calling Mrs. B. So how did you come to speak to Mrs. B?
Well, Mrs. B was referred to us from a local hospital. The bereavement officer had referred her because, really sadly, Mrs. B had to pay for her mother's funeral the year before, and she had absolutely nothing left to pay for her father's funeral now. So I called Mrs. B and she told me all about herself and what the problem was. And that was really good because I needed a full picture of Mrs. B's family, the financial circumstances and employment history, so that we could see what sort of funeral was wanted and how it could be paid for.
Okay, and so what did you find out about the family that helped you to raise funds for them?
Well, it was incredible, really. Mrs. B, she wouldn't have known it, but she actually had a great wealth of connections to grant-giving charities. Unfortunately, she had no access at all to any of the eligible benefits that would have allowed her to apply for the funeral expenses payment from the DWP. She was the only person in a family, in a household of 3 adults and a teenager until her father died, who was at work. And her father had made a financial contribution to the family when he was alive, and her husband had been his carer. So her son wasn't at work or in education, severe anxiety. She told me that she'd worked for 12 years as a teaching assistant, and that meant she could apply to both of the education charities for money towards the funeral. We never want to set people up to face rejection, so we always check the online criteria or phone the charity before we suggest applying. Take a number of weeks for the decision to be made. Some clients do find the process of applying quite intrusive, arduous, and frustrating. He was also a member of Unison, which is a union that does help its members with funeral expenses. And the union decision also take weeks, unfortunately.
Right, yes. So So she had access to 3 charities connected to her work history. Was there anything beyond that?
Yes, her father was a devout Roman Catholic, and in London, Roman Catholics on a low income are able to apply to the St. John Southworth Fund for a grant of up to £1,500 for a funeral. Mrs. B wasn't a church member anymore. She felt that she shouldn't apply, but I reassured her that it can be the person applying or the person whose funeral it is, Roman Catholic. And when you apply through the parish priest, it only takes a few days for a decision to be made. There are actually other charities too, but we thought that was enough to begin with.
So quite a difference there between the length of time that some of the charities take. So that's at least 4 charities in total that she could apply to. So how on earth did you choose where to start?
Well, we needed to take account of the price and date of the funeral and whether money was needed by the funeral director before the funeral could take place. That would help us choose which ones to approach. He told me that she wanted a very simple Roman Catholic cremation and funeral service as soon as possible because of her son's anxiety. And I found 3 low-cost funerals for her, and she looked into them and chose the least expensive, which was only going to cost £1,733. We decided to approach the St. John Southworth Fund, a grant of £1,500, and that would leave only £233 for her to find herself or from another charity. We picked that one because it was going to be nice and quick. And if the funeral director wanted money up front, then that would be provided. And in fact, that's what the funeral director did say. And so the date of the funeral was set after we imagined the money would come. That all worked out well. Mrs. B kept in mind all the time that she didn't want to waste money charity could give to another person, and she picked an early morning slot at the crematorium because that's quite a lot, and it was arranged for the next week.
Wow, so that sounded like it all worked really well. So how about the last couple of hundred? What happened there?
She started an application to one of the education charities, and because she didn't want to apply to her union, she felt really ashamed and embarrassed not to be able to afford the funeral. And she was really worried, probably completely unnecessarily, that her personal information would get known by her colleagues. However much you reassure somebody and try and help them feel that it's not a question to be ashamed about, people still do feel that very acutely. So she actually abandoned the application because of some great news in her family. Mrs. B was able to pay it herself because her husband got a full-time job, and that just made her feel much better. That was a great end to the whole chapter for her.
Oh, great. So I guess how does it feel for you when you help someone like Mrs. B?
Well, it just feels great to help someone in such a difficult position when you start talking to them, absolutely feeling they've got nowhere to turn, they don't know where they're going to get money from, got an idea of how much it will cost, and they think it's an absolute mountain to climb. And by the end of the phone call, you know that you're going to have provided some idea of the way forward and what solutions there will be. And that means that the person can actually start to grieve properly, not just ruminate over and over this insoluble problem. So that feels great to be able to do that for somebody.
Well, thanks very much, Claire. We'll leave that one there just now, and we'll welcome Jill. Unfortunately, raising funds isn't always so easy. And it may not be possible for someone to take responsibility for the funeral themselves. So last but certainly not least, we're going to hear from Jill about what is sometimes sadly a Herculean battle to get a public health funeral. Thank you, Jill.
Hello, everyone. As Lindsay says, I'm Jill. I'm also one of the development workers at Down to Earth. And I'm going to talk a bit about the struggle getting public health funerals. So that's the funerals provided by sort of like local councils. So there's legislation that covers what local authorities must do. And that's the Public Health Control of Diseases Act 1984, and that places a statutory duty on local authorities to make arrangements for a burial or cremation where no other suitable arrangements exist. However, it kind of stops short of saying exactly how they must do this, and it allows sort of quite a lot of flexibility. So there's quite a few differences in how local authorities actually carry these funerals out. There is some non-statutory guidance which kind of goes through good practice and is there to help local authorities, but it is just guidance, and they are quite free to sort of take on board what they want to do and ignore sort of some of the rest there. So we also find that many people think of a public health funeral as being when someone's died and there's no relatives that can be contacted, or someone's been on their own and things, and the local authority ends up having to do that, which is often the case. But here at Down to Earth, we find that we are sort of supporting people who simply can't afford the funeral. They've got no funds and they've got no options to raise those funds. None of the things that my colleagues have talked about are sort of like available to them for one thing or another. So the situation, like I said, in terms of the guidance and legislation, means that across the country we see a really big sort of difference in how local authorities carry out this duty, and clients are kind of subject to quite a postcode lottery. It's in some ways it's been even harder during the pandemic. It can often be hard to find the right person in a local authority to contact, to start arranging that. But it's been even harder. People working from home. A lot of the councils have been inundated with sort of their bereavement services have been so busy. There've been extra funerals and things, so it's been really quite even more difficult to find that person to contact. And I'd like to talk a little bit about one of my clients, and I'm going to call her Hermione. No Harry Potter sort of connection there, but her partner died in the Christmas 2020 period, and she wanted a burial. She had a very strong feeling that she wanted a burial. This had happened in the family before, and she's told me that she thought that cremation was simply wrong, but she had no recourse to public funds, and she simply had no options to sort of arrange the funeral herself. So one London borough was approached, and whilst they said they would do the funeral, they only do cremations unless they say there's a will in place, which is not really what the guidance says. It says that they should be, that's perhaps one of the ways of establishing things, but really they should be doing other things like talking to the relatives and making a much wider sort of judgment on things. But they say insist on a will, and obviously many people who have very few funds actually have a will. You know, they don't necessarily see the importance of that. So we tried to sort of tackle them, but there was no joy there. I mean, in fact, you know, they could technically be breaking the law, because the Act says that people shouldn't be cremated, you know, against their sort of will and their wishes and beliefs. So there perhaps could be a challenge to that. But of course, people invariably, when they're grieving and bereaved, are not up for sort of like challenging a local authority in that respect. So we've also heard, and this was a different client, so a local authority not allowing someone to attend the funeral, and we hear that quite a lot too. And they've said basically, you know, the person on the other end sent an email to say that of course the family can attend if they can pay, which of course they couldn't. So my client Hermione was desperate and didn't know what to do. So slightly unwisely, she engaged a funeral director, and her partner was transported there with no means to pay. And we were really quite stuck, but Down to Earth kind of advised, and she was able to sort of do a bit of crowdfunding sort of from the community about the situation. A distant relative sort of realized how awful it was and chipped in a bit, and we were also able to sort of support her with a small grant from a charity who have very limited funds, but you know, we felt it was a really necessary situation there. Now, as I said, her partner died sort of in the Christmas period, and the funeral is going to take place, but actually still hasn't taken place yet, and will take place sometime at the end of the month, where he will be buried in a public grave. She didn't want anything particularly fancy, or didn't have huge demands, but at last he will be laid to rest, and she can sort of get on with grieving. And I can only imagine sort of how that's made her feel, you know, because it's been sort of months and she's just not known what she can do.
Sorry, forgot to unmute myself there. Thank you, Jill. Could you just explain for anybody who might not know what a public grave is, sometimes also referred to as a shared grave?
Okay, yeah, so a public grave, I mean, like, as you say, they sort of do vary quite a lot, but it will be a grave usually where somebody, you know, other people are buried in. Quite often there won't be a sort of particular memorial, and you can't put a headstone on there. Different cemeteries have slightly different policies on whether they have sort of like a communal memorial and things. Some local authorities are a little bit more progressive, and you know, they will sort of, if someone's in a public grave, sometimes they do give people the option to sort of buy that within a reasonable sort of period of time. But generally it won't be sort of like a dedicated grave just for sort of the person who's died, and you know, perhaps other members of the family later on there. So.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, thanks for that clarification. And I mean, just before we go to the Q&A, I mean, that did sound, you know, that sounds like a couple of cases that were really quite testing for, I mean, you know, particularly for the client, but also for Jill as the worker. And yeah, it can be quite a challenge for us, and feel really quite difficult for us when we're trying to help someone who is bereaved and is facing such obstacles. So yeah, we're going to have a Q&A session now. So thank you to Sophie, Jill, and Gloria and Claire for giving us an insight on all of those things. We've got a few questions, but please do submit any more that you might have. Sophie's going to be our quiz master or question master. So yeah, I'll hand over to you, Sophie, if you want to pick out some questions.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. So Lindsay, I'm actually going to direct the first one to you, if that's okay. Carolyn from Cambridge and Damien have both asked sort of concurrently about considerations for setting up our own price comparison site based on our experience and based on the Fair Funerals Pledge. I know that's something that you and I have spoken briefly about before, hence my directing that one to you, I'm afraid.
Interesting question. So I guess the comparison websites that are out there at the moment, I think there are some difficulties with comparison sites. Quite often there needs to be some kind of payment, exchange of payment between, say, a funeral director and a comparison site. And so that sort of, I guess, effectively means that perhaps the comparison site isn't entirely independent. It also might not contain all the options, because obviously it's a choice whether you're on that comparison website or not. And if you have to pay some of your costs, your fees to the comparison website, you might not want to do that. There are also some difficulties with accuracy from what we've seen in the comparison websites that do exist. And I guess those are all quite big questions that we would need to take into account if we sort of considered doing something like that ourselves. I guess what I would say at the moment is that would be a very large undertaking. And we are quite a small charity and quite a small team, but it's certainly an interesting thing to consider. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. I hope that answered your question somewhat, Carolyn and Damien. I'm going to direct this one to Gloria, if that's okay, Gloria. Susan O'Malley has asked, do we support people nationwide or just those in London?
Okay.
Hi there. We'll answer that one.
Yes. We're actually a UK-wide service. We're all over the telephone. We wouldn't tend to meet people one-to-one, so which means we can work with people in Northern Ireland, Wales, Scotland and England. And that works. There are some different pieces of legislation in different parts of the UK which might slightly change what we're able to do, but yes, we're able to work with people throughout the UK.
Fantastic, thank you, Gloria. There was a second part to that question, which, Lindsay, I'm going to come back over to you again. I'm very sorry. Do you supply information on grant-giving charities?
So, I mean, part of what we do when we support people is that we potentially signpost them to grant-giving charities, or if somebody really needs. We're a small team. We support 600, 700 people a year, so we're not unfortunately able to complete applications with everybody, but where somebody kind of really needs that extra help, maybe literacy is a bit difficult for them, or they don't have access to the internet, and the application needs to be done online, and we will also help people make applications. There are also some charities where an application has to come through us as an intermediary, so it will be a mixture of the two, and our online resources, which anybody can access, also sort of have some tips around looking at grant giving charities, and particularly highlighting the Turn to Us grant search, which Turn to Us being another charity, and their grant search is quite helpful. So I hope that answers that.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. E. Pauly has asked that lots of funeral directors are requesting payment up front before they agree to take on funeral. Do we have any advice for this issue? Jill, am I able to direct that question to you, please?
Sorry, I was clicking madly, but it wasn't unmuting, and I've now succeeded. So yes, obviously the client I talked about, I think funeral directors often will sort of like collect someone if someone's dies at home and things. Ultimately, they're not necessarily always going to sort of like do a check before they sort of like take someone in, but often they won't carry out a funeral without sort of the money sort of being in place, and we have that sort of like quite a lot. You know, sometimes it's the whole of the money often with simple funerals, and they're sort of like more budget packages. Funeral directors do require all the money to sort of like be paid up front, and we would sort of try and help somebody sort of raise that. Sometimes we can negotiate with funeral directors a bit as well, if we know that there's either money coming sort of perhaps from the estate, or there's money coming sort of from a charity, that we can sort of like give them a sort of almost guarantee that they will get the money. But we felt it was probably quite unusual in the case, in my client's case, that I don't know perhaps what she said to the funeral director, but we were quite sort of stunned really that they had gone collected the deceased when there clearly probably wasn't any money sort of in place. But as I said, funeral directors can't really do a check, and we wouldn't really want them to be doing a check sort of beforehand, but it can cause people sort of quite a few problems.
Can I just sort of feed off from that, just in terms of when somebody's eligible for the funeral expenses payment, which I'm aware we haven't kind of talked too much about so far today. What can be a little tricky there is that we can't ask a charity for any money that the DWP or Social Security Scotland is going to pay. We can only ask for what we believe will be the shortfall. By and large, the DWP specifically is processing applications a lot quicker than they used to. I mentioned them because they used to be quite bad at processing applications very slowly. Social Security Scotland have always tended to be sort of a bit quicker since they started the funeral support payment last year. So it's not quite so bad now if somebody needs to wait for the funeral expenses payment to come through in order to have the funeral, because it is possible to get a payment in advance of the funeral from both the DWP and Social Security Scotland. But it can still potentially take sort of 3 to 4 weeks for that to come through, and so that's kind of an added thing to bear in mind, to take into account, I guess, if a funeral director is asking for a significant amount of money in advance. Thanks.
Thank you, Lindsay, and thank you, Jill. A question, a sort of two-part question, which I'm happy to answer, which is from Katie, who's a social worker at Loros Hospice in Leicestershire. Do you as an organisation help clients to make phone calls to funeral directors, as we often find families to be overwhelmed at the prospect of doing this? And does a client need a referral from a professional, or can they self-refer? So people can either self-refer, or professionals can refer their clients to us via our website. We have a referral form on there. It is important when referring a client. I know you're all very aware of the realms of GDPR, but just make sure you have the client's permission before referring them. And yes, we can help people with those phone calls to funeral directors if they don't feel that's something they're able to do. We do encounter clients who want to take the reins and want to do as much as they can themselves, and we're absolutely empower them to do that. But by the same token, like you say, Katie, there are clients who don't feel able to for a variety of reasons, and we're more than happy to help. Claire, we've had a couple of questions on clients with no recourse to public funds, about what help might be available for them. Are you able to offer some pearls of wisdom there?
I'll try. I hope I apologise for the sound not being great. Is it okay at the moment? Yeah.
Seems fine to me. Yeah.
We have got some access to some small charities that will give people who have no recourse to public funds some money. So sometimes we apply to them. The other thing is that although the person might not have recourse to public funds, it might still be possible for them to have public health funeral. And if a person is from a certain community or background, for example, there is a Muslim burial fund, very often will help anybody. You don't, you need to be Muslim, obviously, but they will actually provide the whole service and arrange the funeral and sort everything out. And then they raise funds afterwards for that funeral. I'm just trying to think of any other examples. I think sometimes crowdfunding can help with this, because very often people with no recourse to public funds, doesn't mean they haven't got loads of friends, and although the friends might not be particularly well off, they are often the most generous people, and they will give towards somebody's funeral when they know that it's going to be a problem. So there's some ideas. I don't know if anyone else wants to mention anything.
You've got no volunteers there, Claire.
No,
Thank you
no.
very much. I think
Well,
that was really thorough.
I can just because I went on another webinar, and that sometimes if someone's been recently sort of bereaved and they might be destitute, we couldn't advise on this, but they may be able to get that no recourse to public funds condition lifted by, you know, in exceptional circumstances. So that might also be something, like I said, we obviously can't give immigration advice, but we might signpost them to see whether that status could be changed and they could then access public funds. But it's not necessarily going to be an easy thing. Yeah.
Thank you very much, all.
And Gloria's just got her hand up.
Sorry, Gloria, I do apologise. I had a window.
That's all right. I have example of a situation where it's a couple who had no recourse to public funds. Husband died, but he had been working. He'd been paying his national insurance contributions. And so although his wife couldn't make any application for funeral expenses payments for more than one reason, not just about the no recourse, there are other reasons again, she could apply for bereavement support payments as the spouse of someone who'd been paying their national insurance contributions. We wouldn't ordinarily want people to have to use bereavement support payment towards a funeral. That's about surviving and living after the death. But in these circumstances, it was a great help.
Thank you, Gloria. I think we may have time for just one last question, which was Sally Cruz. And Sally, you were one of the first ones to ask. So you're last but by absolutely no means least here. And I understand you work on a bereavement helpline offering emotional support, and we're looking for information about assistance for a young refugee who had just had a late-term miscarriage, and about funeral directors offering free funerals for children. So many funeral directors don't charge for services for children. There are a few that do. There is also the Child Funeral Fund, which contributes an amount towards the burial and cremation, which normally means that is free of charge, and up to £300 towards the cost of a coffin for a child. Now, there are other charity organisations, but I think it may be worth, if you're able to and willing, and your client is willing, maybe get in touch with us and we can discuss it more fully. So I hope you have our helpline number. Give us a call and one of our team will give you a call back to advise more fully on that. I hope that's helpful for you. Lindsay, I think we're out of time for questions. I'm going to hand over to you.
Yes, thank you, Sophie. So yeah, I'm aware it's 3 o'clock on the dot. Just to sort of close, some closing comments very briefly. First of all, thank you so much everyone for being here and for all your great questions. It would have just been us talking to ourselves otherwise. We'll have a look. I know there are some other questions that we haven't been able to get to, so we'll have a look and see if we can maybe provide some sort of written responses in a follow-up email, where we can also provide some links and information about our helpline for any referrals anyone might want to make. But I also just wanted to close with a call to arms, if you like. The theme of this year's Dying Matters week is the question, are you in a good place to die? Preparing for death knowing you're not financially in a good place can cause great anxiety and guilt because of the difficulties it may cause for those left behind. And those feelings are often then continued in the person arranging the funeral, desperate to give a loved one what they feel is a good send-off, but unable to, or terrified of getting into debt. So what is the solution to this? Naturally, we encourage people to plan for their funeral where possible, to communicate their wishes to those closest to them, and to make financial provision if they can. But what if you can't? Funeral poverty is not a creation of people's lack of personal responsibility. And I feel it's important to say that. It is a result of many things, and it needs action from the government. This is why part of the work that we do is to try to make long-term change. So I just want to leave you with the main asks that we continue to ask for from the government: to increase the funeral expenses and funeral support payments to cover the cost of a simple funeral, to revise the funeral expenses payment eligibility criteria to make it less confusing and more accessible, to create adequate statutory minimum standards for public health funerals, and to establish independent regulation of the funeral industry and bring in price controls. So if you want to help us to be involved in collective action when it happens, please do sign up to our Funeral Poverty Alliance. The link will be in the chat, but we will also send it out after this. So thank you again all for coming, and thank you to all of the team, and take care, and speak to you at some point in the future, hopefully. Bye.